Imagine you're a shopkeeper in Tehran. You're watching the value of your life savings turn to dust. Just 2 weeks ago, you needed 1.47 million reals to buy a single US dollar. Today, that number is even higher. The cost of everything is exploding. And for the last 3 weeks, the streets have filled with protests born from pure economic desperation. Now, the mainstream story you've heard 1,000 times is simple. Sanctions. A stranglehold from the outside world. But what if that's a convenient lie? What if the real cause is something much deeper, a sickness that has been festering inside the country for decades? Because before the collapse, Iran was an economic powerhouse. Today, it's a nation bleeding from 5 fatal wounds. And until you see them, you'll never understand the real story. To understand the chaos in Tehran's markets today, you have to look back. Not a few years, but a few decades. Because the Iran you see now is not the Iran that was being built. Before 1979, the country was on a trajectory that surprises most people. It was undergoing rapid, massive industrialization. The economy was booming, and by 1977, Iran had climbed to become the 18th largest economy on the planet. For perspective, that put it ahead of regional powers like Turkey and rising stars like South Korea. It was an economic powerhouse in the making. Then came the revolution. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 wasn't just a change of government. It was a fundamental rewiring of the nation's economic soul. The new leadership reversed course entirely. Policy shifted away from the urban, elite-centered model and refocused on rural development. But this pivot came at an incredible cost, kicking off what you could call the 40-year storm. Almost immediately, the country was plunged into a brutal, costly 8-year war. This conflict drained the treasury and scarred a generation. At the same time, the doors to the world began to close. Unremitting international pressure and growing isolation started to choke off trade and investment. The economic engine that had been roaring in the 70s sputtered and stalled. This wasn't a sudden collapse. It was a long, slow bleed. A steady decline visible in the data. Remember that ranking as the 18th largest economy in 1977? By 2017, 4 decades later, Iran had fallen to 27th place. The rocket had run out of fuel and was slowly drifting back to Earth. But a slow drift doesn't explain the panic we see today. It doesn't explain why a currency suddenly becomes worthless. So what turned this long, grinding decline into an outright collapse? What lit the fuse on the current explosion? The answer begins with the first, and perhaps most famous, of the 5 fatal wounds. It's easy to see this as a distant problem. Another headline from a country thousands of miles away. But the chaos unfolding in Iran is a financial warning shot for the entire world. Think about your own bank account. Now imagine nearly half its value vanishing in a single year. That's not an exaggeration. The latest numbers show an annual inflation rate of 48.6%. This is a silent tax that steals your future. Your savings for a house, for your kids, education, for retirement, all of it, effectively cut in half, every 12 months. When an economy this size, with its strategic importance, begins to fracture, the shockwaves don't stop at its borders. They ripple through oil markets, global supply chains, and international security. What starts with protests in Tehran can end with higher prices at your local gas pump. This level of economic self-destruction isn't an accident. It's the result of specific choices made over decades. So how did a nation once on the path to becoming a global powerhouse end up in a state of terminal decline? The path to ruin is paved with good intentions. In the decades before the Great Upheaval, Iran was industrializing at a breakneck pace. It was a society geared for urban growth, for global competition. Then, everything changed. The country's new clerical leadership flipped the economic script entirely. I call it the Great Reversal. The focus shifted from the cities to the countryside, from the elites to the masses. The goal was to build a self-sufficient, populous state, insulated from the outside world. But this new system had consequences. A devastating 8-year war drained the treasury. Unrelenting international pressure began to build. The state, trying to provide for its people, took on more and more responsibility and more debt. Just look at the numbers. From 1996 to 2024, government debt averaged nearly 30% of the entire economy. By 2020, it had ballooned to a staggering 48.3%. This wasn't just a string of bad luck. It was a structural problem. The government was spending far more than it was taking in, with a budget deficit sitting at over 4% of GDP. This created a nation walking a financial tightrope. heavily reliant on a single commodity to stay balanced. The country was being hollowed out from the inside, long before the most powerful sanctions were ever put in place. But this internal decay also created the perfect vulnerability, a weakness that outsiders could exploit. And it exposed a hidden mechanism, an economic flaw so deep it would eventually threaten to bring the entire system crashing down. So how does a country with vast oil reserves go broke? It's not one single decision. It's a machine, built over decades, that is now running in reverse. A system designed to solve a problem by secretly making it infinitely worse. We call it the ghost budget. Think of it like this. Imagine your family loses its main source of income. But to keep the peace at home, you pretend everything is fine. You keep spending on credit cards exactly as you did before. You pay for food, for gas, for everything with money you don't have. For a little while it works. The illusion holds. But soon, the bills come due. And the only way to pay them is to take out new, bigger credit cards, just to cover the interest on the old ones. That is what is happening to an entire nation. Here's how the ghost budget operates, step by fatal step. First, the government makes a promise to its people. Cheap fuel and cheap food. These are massive, nationwide subsidies designed to keep the public calm and prevent unrest. It's a political anesthetic. Second, the reality. Sanctions and mismanagement have choked off the government's real income. There isn't nearly enough money coming in to pay for those promises. Officially, Iran's government is spending far more than it earns, running a deficit of over 4% of its entire economic output. So the third and final step. To cover this gap, to pay for the subsidies, the central bank is forced to create money out of thin air. A ghost fleet of cash, flooding the system to pay the state's bills. But this isn't free money. Every new Ryle printed is an invisible tax on your savings. It dilutes the value of all the money already in circulation. The very subsidies meant to help people end up fueling the hyperinflation that burns their life's work to the ground. It's a snake eating its own tail. This isn't just a theory. It's a mathematical certainty, hidden in plain sight within Iran's own financial statements. And when you run the numbers, you can pinpoint the exact moment this system became a doomsday machine. The first cracks appeared not in a bank vault or a government ministry, but in the heart of Tehran's Grand Bazaar. For generations, these merchants were the lifeblood of the city, masters of negotiation, price, and profit. But they became the first victims of a system eating itself alive. They found themselves trapped in what we can call the pricing nightmare. Here's how it works. Imagine you sell handmade carpets. You sell a beautiful one today for 100 million rials. You feel successful. But when you go to buy more wool and dyes tomorrow, the price has jumped. The 100 million you just earned now buys less than what you started with. Your profit was an illusion. You are working harder than ever, only to go bankrupt in slow motion. This isn't a hypothetical. By September of 2025, the official annual inflation rate was already scorching at 45.3%. Think about that. The cost of everything you need to run your business and your life is nearly 50% higher than it was just 1 year ago. How do you set a price? How do you pay your employees? How do you feed your family when the ground is constantly shifting beneath your feet? You can't. So at the end of 2025, the merchants of the bazaar did the only thing they could. They closed their shops. The metal shutters came down, one by one, a deafening chorus of economic surrender. This wasn't a holiday. It was a desperate protest against a currency collapsing in their hands. The pain of the first victim was no longer silent. It spilled out from the covered alleyways of the market and onto the streets, where students, and then the public at large, picked up the cry. A deadly crackdown followed, an attempt to silence the symptoms of a disease the government couldn't cure. But this was just the beginning. How can a government make you poorer by giving you cheap gasoline? It sounds like a riddle, a paradox, but this is the hidden engine at the heart of Iran's economic collapse. A machine designed to help that is now burning the country's wealth to ash. I call it the Ryle Furnace. Here's how it works. Step 1. The social promise. To maintain stability, the government promises to keep essentials affordable. Think bread, electricity, and especially fuel. They put a hard cap on the price you pay at the pump. For the average person, this feels like a lifeline, a core benefit of citizenship. This isn't an accident. It was formalized in policies like the Subsidy Reform Plan over a decade ago. It's a political necessity. But that oil has a real price on the world market, and reality always sends a bill. Step 2. The reality gap. Someone has to pay the massive difference between the subsidized price you pay and the much higher price on the global market. That someone is the state. This creates a colossal hole in the national budget, a hole that gets deeper every single day. Right now, Iran's government is spending far more than it earns. The official budget deficit, what economists call net borrowing, is over 4% of the country's entire economic output. Imagine your household spending 4% more than it earns, year after year, with no access to loans. So where does a government, cut off from global finance, find that kind of cash? This is the hidden mechanic, the part most people miss. Step 3. They don't find it. They create it. The central bank turns on the digital printing presses. It creates new rials out of thin air, trillions of them, and uses this phantom money to pay its bills, including the subsidies. Think of it like a magic credit card. You can swipe it for anything, and it's never declined. The only catch is that every time you use it, the value of every single dollar in your savings account secretly drops by a fraction of a cent. You don't notice the individual purchases. But after 1,000 swipes, you look at your life savings and realize it can only buy half of what it could a year ago. That is the Ryle Furnace. It's a hidden tax that punishes savers, workers, and businesses. That cheap gasoline isn't a gift. It's a loan taken from your future, with hyperinflation as the crippling interest payment. You see the low price at the pump and thank the government. You see the soaring price of chicken and curse the markets. You don't realize they are two sides of the same debased coin, minted in the central bank. This isn't just a theory. The numbers tell the whole terrifying story. When you actually run the math on Iran's budget deficit against its money supply, you can see the machine in action, and the scale of it is staggering. The financial fire that started in the Tehran Bazaar didn't stay contained. It jumped the fire breaks. It left the capital and began to burn through the country's industrial heartland. This is where the first fatal wound began to fester, spreading from a single street to an entire sector of the economy. A much larger, much more dangerous failure. Think of a massive steel mill miles outside the city. A symbol of national pride, built to forge the country's independent future. Now, imagine its furnaces are cold, its workers idle. This is the story of the industrial Mirage. It was a grand promise made decades ago to build a powerful, self-sufficient Iran, free from foreign dependence. To do this, the state handpicked industries, steel, automotive, manufacturing, and sealed them in a protective bubble. Inside this bubble, the rules of economics didn't apply. You got government loans you'd never have to repay in full. You got electricity and natural gas for a fraction of the world price. You were guaranteed buyers for whatever you produced. But this gilded cage had a fatal flaw. The state was printing money to keep these companies alive, which caused hyperinflation. That inflation then destroyed the savings of the very people who were supposed to buy the cars and steel these factories were making. It's a perfect, self-devouring machine. The government prints rials to subsidize the factory. The factory makes a product that no one can actually afford without more subsidies. The lesson from the shopkeepers, that you can't escape reality, was ignored. The government saw the pain in the bazaar and, instead of changing course, they doubled down. They applied the same broken logic, but this time to the scale of a nation's entire industrial base. The cost of this fantasy is written in black and white on the national balance sheet. The government's official net borrowing is negative 4.27% of the entire country's economic output. That's the deficit they run, year after year, just to keep these ghost industries from collapsing. It's a wound that never heals, constantly draining the lifeblood of the nation. What began as a pricing problem for a merchant has become a solvency crisis for a country of 88 million people. And here's where it gets personal. Let's ignore the headlines and look at the cold, hard math. Because the numbers tell a story that no politician can spin. The entire world economy, as of late 2025, generates roughly $123 trillion in value. It's an almost incomprehensible figure. Iran's slice of that global pie is just $375 billion. What does that actually mean? It means that for every $1,000 of wealth created on this planet, Iran's entire economy, its oil fields, its factories, its 88 million people, accounts for just $3. It's a rounding error on the global balance sheet. This isn't just a slump. It's what we can call the global downgrade. A nation that once stood as the world's 18th largest economy has been pushed to the absolute margins. But that's the view from 30,000 feet. What does this collapse feel like for you, on the ground? We need to look at the machine that grinds personal wealth into dust: chronic inflation. In 2022, prices jumped by over 43%. The very next year, they leaped again by more than 44%. This isn't a single shockwave. It's a relentless, year-after-year assault on your savings. Let's run that calculation. If you had $100 saved at the start of 2022, by the end of 2023, it would only buy what $31 could before. Nearly 70% of your money's power simply erased, not spent, not stolen. Evaporated by a broken economic engine. The government is bleeding money. Your savings are becoming worthless. The country's global standing has been decimated. The system is fundamentally unstable. So what happens when the numbers no longer add up? What are the possible futures for a nation on the brink? Now, whenever you point out a system in crisis, you'll always find the skeptics. They'll look at the data and say, it's not that bad. They'll point to Iran's government debt, which has averaged just over 28% of its economy for decades. For comparison, that's a figure most Western governments can only dream of. From a distance, it looks like stability. It looks like control. So where's the collapse? That argument is a perfect example of what you could call the Mirage metric. It's a number that looks solid in a report, but turns to dust when you try to touch it. Because a low national debt is meaningless when your people are being crushed. The real story isn't written in government ledgers. It's priced into every loaf of bread in Tehran. While the government's books might look tidy, the annual inflation rate tells the truth. The latest reading from October 2025 puts it at a blistering 48.6%. Think about that. The cost of living is on track to double in less than 2 years. It's a silent tax that bleeds every single family, every single day. That's the force that evaporates savings and sends merchants into the streets, protesting not against a line item in a budget, but against the impossible cost of survival. To be fair, the Iranian system has shown a shocking resilience. It has endured decades of immense pressure without completely shattering. The skeptics aren't wrong about its ability to bend without breaking. But even if they were right, so where does this end? When a system is this broken, the future splits into two distinct paths. Scenario A is the conservative forecast. Let's call it the long decline. In this future, nothing fundamentally changes. The government continues to run a primary deficit, spending more than it takes in, even before interest payments. Protests flare up, as they did just weeks ago, but deadly crackdowns keep them from boiling over. The real continues its slow, agonizing bleed against the dollar. This isn't a sudden collapse. It's a slow-motion demolition of a nation's wealth, where the pain is spread out over years, making it just tolerable enough to prevent a full-scale revolution. It's the most probable outcome, simply because systems in decline can stumble on for longer than anyone expects. Then there's Scenario B, the stress test. This is the failure cascade. It's a low-probability, high-impact event triggered by a single shock, a new wave of sanctions, a disastrous attempt at subsidy reform, a regional conflict that cuts off the last remaining economic lifelines. In this scenario, inflation doesn't just climb, it explodes. The currency doesn't just fall, it becomes worthless. The state loses its ability to pay for security, and the protests are no longer containable. This is the sudden stop, the point of no return. Of course, the skeptic will argue that Iran has faced these predictions for decades. They'll say the regime is resilient, that it has always found a way to survive. And they have a point. But let's be fair, there's a powerful counter-argument here. A story that says this entire collapse is not a suicide, but a murder. This argument places the blame squarely on one thing: sanctions. It says that for decades, Iran has been the target of a relentless campaign of economic warfare, a siege designed to choke its trade, paralyze its banks, and starve its people into submission. From this perspective, the failing currency and rampant inflation aren't symptoms of internal mismanagement. They are the intended results of a foreign policy sledgehammer. And you can't deny the impact. Unrelenting international pressure has been a constant reality since the revolution. But that story is dangerously incomplete. It ignores the choices made within Iran that turned a difficult situation into a catastrophic one. Sanctions can wound an economy, but they can't, by themselves, create the kind of internal decay we're seeing. To do that, you need what I call the generosity trap. Think back to 2007, when the government massively expanded subsidies on everything from food to energy. It was a politically popular move, designed to shield citizens from hardship. But it created a phantom economy, a system so distorted and dependent on artificial prices that it lost all ability to adapt. When the external pressure of sanctions was reapplied, the system didn't just bend, it shattered. Sanctions explain the force of the blow. They don't explain the brittleness of the bone. And to truly understand this crisis, we have to move beyond geopolitics and look at the structural flaws. That's where I believe the real story is found. So, what am I doing with my own money? Before I say another word, I have to be crystal clear. This is not financial advice. This is simply a journal of my own thinking, a framework for navigating a world that is becoming more volatile by the day. Personally, I am watching for a single, specific signal. I call it the capitulation point. This is the moment when the government's deadly crackdown on the ongoing protests either succeeds completely, creating a desolate stability, or it fails, forcing a radical and immediate change in policy. The trigger isn't the chaos you see on the news, it's the silence that comes after. My strategy is built on disciplined position sizing. For my own portfolio, any exposure here would be a tiny, speculative bet, less than 1%. It's a high-risk thesis, a gambler's logic, not an investment plan. It's a bet that the market has priced in a total, irreversible collapse, but is completely ignoring the possibility of a sudden, violent reversal to the upside. Because while everyone is focused on the death spiral, they are missing the signs of a potential explosive rally. A rally born not from recovery, but from desperation. And it all starts with the one asset Iran has left to sell. This is how a nation's future is erased. Not in a single, sudden shock, but through 5 deep wounds, carved slowly over decades. The economic data is just the obituary, written long in advance. The real story is happening right now, on the streets, where protests that began with shopkeepers and spread to students were met with a deadly crackdown just weeks ago. This is the brutal human price of a system running in reverse. The crisis in Iran is a warning flare, illuminating the cracks in the global foundation. The most dangerous question isn't how this story ends for them, but how it begins for everyone else. We are tracking the fallout of this collapse because it reveals a universal truth. A government can print money, but it can never print trust.